Labor has a way of shrinking the world into breath and pain and time measured in contractions. So when our daughter finally cried for the first time, I felt everything else dissolve into relief. I remember gripping the sides of the hospital bed and crying from exhaustion and joy at the same time while the nurse lifted her up briefly before taking her to be cleaned. My husband Daniel was beside me the entire time, pale but steady, squeezing my hand so tightly I could feel the imprint of his wedding ring against my skin. We had spent months imagining what she would look like, arguing playfully about whose nose she would inherit, whose smile, whose stubborn streak. Both of us have dark features, black hair, brown eyes, the kind of coloring that runs deep through generations on both sides. It never occurred to either of us that genetics could surprise us in any dramatic way. When the nurse brought her back wrapped tightly in a blanket, she looked down at the baby for a second longer than expected before placing her gently in my arms. I was too overwhelmed to notice at first. I was staring at the tiny rise and fall of her chest, at her impossibly small fingers curling instinctively around mine. Daniel leaned over my shoulder and then went very still. I felt his body tense before I processed why. I looked down more carefully, and that's when I saw it. A halo of unmistakable bright red hair framing her tiny forehead. Not auburn, not a brown with hints of warmth, bright red, the kind that catches light immediately. For a moment, I simply stared at it as if my brain needed time to translate what my eyes were seeing. Daniel stepped back slightly and said quietly, almost to himself, "That's impossible." The word landed heavier than I expected. I looked up at him confused, still floating in that fragile post-birth haze. Impossible how? The nurse shifted her weight awkwardly and adjusted the blanket as if covering more of the baby's head would soften the contrast. She avoided eye contact in a way that pricked at my awareness. I asked if something was wrong and she said no, she's perfectly healthy, and her voice sounded a shade too rehearsed. Daniel ran a hand through his own dark hair and then looked at me in a way that made my stomach tighten. He said neither of us have red hair in our families. I opened my mouth to respond, but found myself searching memory instead. I tried to recall childhood photos, distant relatives at holidays, any trace of copper or strawberry blonde. Nothing obvious surfaced. I said genetics can skip generations, can't they? And the nurse nodded quickly, too quickly, as if clinging to that explanation. Daniel didn't look convinced. His eyes kept drifting between me and the baby like he was doing silent math. Before the tension could settle fully, the door opened and my mother-in-law, Patricia, stepped inside carrying a bouquet of pale pink flowers. She was smiling widely until her gaze fell on the baby in my arms. The color drained from her face so suddenly it was almost physical. The bouquet dipped slightly in her hand. She didn't say anything at first, just stared. Then she looked at Daniel, not at me, and something unspoken passed between them. It was subtle but unmistakable. A flash of recognition. Of alarm. I felt a cold ripple move through my body that had nothing to do with postpartum chills. I asked what was wrong, and Patricia forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She said she was just overwhelmed. But she wasn't looking at the baby with the kind of joy you expect from a grandmother. She was looking at her like she had seen something familiar that shouldn't be there. Daniel asked his mother quietly if there was anyone in the family with red hair, and she hesitated just long enough to confirm that the answer wasn't simple. She said not that I know of, and then quickly corrected herself and said maybe very distant relatives. Her voice wavered slightly. I felt my pulse start to race in a way that had nothing to do with labor. I had just given birth, and instead of basking in uncomplicated joy, I was watching the two people closest to me exchange glances that felt loaded. The nurse lingered near the foot of the bed longer than necessary, checking monitors that didn't need checking. I noticed her eyes flick briefly toward Patricia and then back to Daniel. Something about the atmosphere felt staged, like a scene where everyone knew a line except me. I asked directly if there was some kind of mistake, and Daniel snapped his head toward me sharply and said, "What do you mean mistake?" The defensiveness in his tone startled me more than the hair color. I said a hospital mix-up, that's all, because suddenly my mind was racing through worst-case scenarios. Bobby's switched at birth. Administrative errors. It sounded dramatic, but so did the look on Patricia's face. The nurse assured us firmly that there had been no mix-up. She said identification bands were verified multiple times. She even checked my wristband again as if to reinforce it. The baby in my arms was mine, biologically mine. There was no confusion there. I felt a strange mixture of relief and renewed tension. If there was no hospital error, then the question shifted. Daniel looked at me again, this time with something more than confusion, something like doubt. He didn't say the word, but it hovered in the room. I felt anger spark through the exhaustion. I asked him plainly if he was suggesting what I thought he was suggesting. He said he didn't know what to think, and that red hair requires a recessive gene from both parents. The way he said it sounded rehearsed, like knowledge he had accessed before. I asked him how he suddenly became a genetic expert, and he didn't answer. Patricia stepped closer to the bed then and reached out hesitantly to brush a finger over the baby's tiny head. Her hand trembled slightly. She whispered something under her breath that I almost didn't catch. It can't be. I asked what can't be, and she shook her head quickly, saying she was just emotional. But her eyes were no longer on the baby. They were on Daniel, and the expression on her face was not confusion. It was fear. In that moment, I realized something with chilling clarity. The red hair wasn't triggering suspicion of me. It was triggering memory in her. I shifted the baby slightly and looked directly at Patricia. I asked her if she knew something she wasn't saying. Daniel's jaw tightened visibly. The nurse finally excused herself, saying she would give us privacy, and the door closed softly behind her. The room felt smaller without her neutral presence. Patricia sank slowly into the chair near the window, clutching the bouquet in her lap. Daniel told her to stop overreacting, but his voice carried strain. I asked again what was wrong, and Patricia looked at me with eyes that were suddenly older than I had ever seen them. She said, "There's something you both need to understand." Daniel interrupted sharply. Saying this is not the time. Patricia ignored him. She kept looking at the baby, at that bright red hair that seemed almost luminous under the hospital lights. She said quietly that Daniel's father had black hair too. My pulse thudded in my ears, I knew that. I had seen countless family photos, dark hair, dark eyes, strong resemblance. She swallowed hard and continued, but Daniel was born with red hair. The room went completely still. Daniel stared at her like she had spoken a foreign language. He said that's not true. Patricia nodded slowly, tears gathering at the edges of her eyes. She said it was bright red at birth, just like this. And then it darkened within the first year. No one talks about it because there was never a reason to. I felt my grip tighten protectively around my daughter. Daniel shook his head in disbelief and said he's seen baby pictures. Patricia nodded again and said she dyed it darker before most photos were taken because his father hated it. The air felt thin. This wasn't about me. This wasn't about infidelity. This was about something buried deeper. I asked why his father would hate it, and Patricia's eyes flicked up toward Daniel with hesitation. She said because it wasn't from his side of the family. Daniel's breathing became uneven. I watched the realization begin to form before the words did. Patricia finally said the sentence that fractured the last piece of illusion in the room. Daniel's father wasn't his biological father. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before. I looked down at my daughter's bright red hair and felt something shift from accusation to inheritance. Daniel took a step back as if physically struck. Patricia began to cry softly and said she had never planned to reveal this, that she thought it would die with her husband, that the red hair at birth was the only visible clue, but his father refused to question it publicly. I felt a strange combination of protectiveness and clarity wash over me. The impossible wasn't impossible. It was history repeating itself. And the doubt that had flashed across Daniel's face minutes earlier now turned inward toward something far older than our marriage. He looked at me then, not with suspicion but with shame. And in that hospital room, holding our daughter for the first time, I realized the revelation wasn't about her at all. It was about the secret his family had buried decades ago finally surfacing through a single strand of bright red hair. Daniel took another step back until he was nearly pressed against the wall, like the room itself had shifted its gravity, and he didn't know where to stand anymore. Patricia kept crying softly into her hands, the bouquet slipping sideways in her lap, petals scattering onto the hospital floor. I was still sitting upright in the bed, exhausted and stitched and holding our newborn daughter against my chest. But suddenly I felt like the only stable person in the room. The red hair that had moments ago felt like a spotlight now felt like proof. Not of betrayal, of biology, of a truth that had been buried long before I entered this family. Daniel finally spoke, his voice strained and thin. He said, "Why are you telling me this now?" Patricia wiped her eyes and said, "Because I thought it would never matter." She said when Daniel was born with red hair, his father refused to believe it meant anything. He insisted it was some distant genetic anomaly, something recessive from a forgotten ancestor. But Patricia knew better. She said she had been unfaithful once, early in the marriage, before Daniel was conceived. She said it was brief and impulsive, and she ended it immediately. When she found out she was pregnant, she convinced herself the timing might still make sense. She never admitted doubt out loud. She never tested it. She let her husband believe what he wanted to believe. And when Daniel's hair darkened within a year, the visible evidence faded enough to make denial comfortable. Daniel stared at her like he was watching his childhood rearrange itself in real time. He asked quietly if his father knew. Patricia shook her head and said he suspected. She said there were arguments in those early months, accusations thrown in anger but never pursued. She said the red hair haunted him, but once it darkened he chose silence over scandal. They both did. They built a marriage around a secret that calcified instead of healing. I watched Daniel's expression shift from shock to something more complex. It wasn't just betrayal. It was identity fracture. The man he grew up believing was his biological father had died 3 years earlier. Daniel had spoken at the funeral about legacy and resemblance and inherited stubbornness. Now those memories felt unstable. I reached for Daniel's hand instinctively, and he hesitated before taking it, like he wasn't sure what version of himself was standing there. Patricia looked at me then, her guilt widening beyond her son. She said she was sorry for the doubt that flickered across his face when he saw the baby, that she recognized it immediately because she had seen that same doubt once before in her husband's eyes. She said she never imagined it would resurface like this. I felt something soften in me, not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. The red hair wasn't an accusation against me. It was a mirror held up to a past she thought had disappeared. Daniel finally stepped closer to the bed and looked down at our daughter again. This time his expression was different. Not suspicion, not disbelief, recognition. He ran a gentle finger over the tiny copper strands and whispered that it would probably darken like his did. I felt tears slip down my temples into my hair, not from pain but from release. The tension that had filled the room minutes earlier dissolved into something heavier but more honest. The next few days were not simple. DNA tests were mentioned but not immediately pursued. Daniel needed space to process what it meant that the man who raised him might not share his blood. Patricia offered to tell him everything she remembered about the other man, about timelines and names, about a chapter she had sealed away. Daniel listened without anger at first, then with quiet resentment, then with something closer to grief. He wasn't just learning about an affair. He was confronting the idea that identity can be partially constructed on silence. When we brought our daughter home, her red hair catching sunlight through the nursery window, I watched Daniel differently. I watched how carefully he held her, how long he stared at her face as if searching for pieces of himself. One evening, while she slept between us, he admitted that the doubt he felt in the hospital wasn't just about genetics. It was about fear, fear of repeating his father's story, fear that secrets could be inherited like traits. I told him secrets are choices, not genes. He nodded slowly, absorbing that distinction. Weeks later, he decided to take a DNA test, not out of accusation but out of clarity. When the results confirmed that the man who raised him was not his biological father, something inside him settled rather than shattered. He said it explained things he had never been able to articulate, subtle emotional distances in childhood, a sense of difference he couldn't name. It didn't erase the love he felt for the man who raised him, but it reframed it. Love chosen rather than assumed. The real resolution came not in confrontation, but in conversation. Daniel and Patricia sat at our kitchen table one afternoon while I held the baby in the next room. He asked her why she never told him. She said because telling would have broken more than it fixed at the time. He asked if she regretted it. She said every day, not because of shame, but because she underestimated his capacity to handle truth. That sentence lingered in the air long after she left. Months passed and our daughter's hair remained red, bright, and unapologetic. Strangers commented on it constantly, asking where it came from. We stopped offering complicated explanations. Daniel began researching family records quietly, tracing possibilities, but he did it with curiosity instead of anger. The past didn't feel like an accusation anymore. It felt like context. The night I reflected on it fully was months after her birth. I was rocking her in the nursery while Daniel slept. I realized how close our marriage had come to being damaged by a split second of suspicion born from buried history. If Patricia had stayed silent again, if Daniel had clung to doubt instead of listening, the story could have unfolded very differently. Instead, the truth surfaced in a hospital room under fluorescent lights and forced everyone into honesty at once. Our daughter's red hair became less a mystery and more a reminder of the way secrets echo, of the way biology can reveal what silence tries to hide, of the difference between suspicion and inheritance. When I look at her now, I don't see scandal or impossibility. I see continuity, not just of genes, but of lessons learned too late and corrected just in time. And sometimes, when sunlight hits her hair just right, I catch Daniel staring at her with something like awe. Not because she challenges what he believed, but because she proves that truth, even delayed, has a way of finding the surface.